to get started. I'm sure we have a lot of members joining us today. I'm really thrilled. We're going to let them come on, but we can get started. I'll introduce myself. I'm Sara Kay. I'm the founder of the Professional Organization of Women in the Arts. And I'm so delighted to be here, especially because this topic in this program is something that Sheetal had brought to POWarts. I think it was almost a year ago, which is crazy. And we had it scheduled in the calendar for April at SVA, and then COVID happened. And we said, this is such a stellar group. This is such an important topic. Let's wait until we can all be together in person. I don't think any of us ever expected we'd be distanced for so long. So even though we're not together physically, I'm thrilled to see you all. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy to have this conversation. And yeah, I'm going to get started. Before I introduce the speakers, I just wanted to mention some of our upcoming programming. On November 23rd, we will host Perspective on Museums Reopening, featuring Ling Gumpert, who's the director of the Gray Art Gallery at NYU. We have Cindy Kaplan, Chief Counsel and Talent Officer at the Jewish Museum, Jason Bush, Director of the American Folk Art Museum, and it will be moderated by Mali Kurzius, who's Director of External Affairs at PS1 MoMA. And this coming Monday, November 16th, we'll resume our very popular Colleagues and Friends program, and it will feature Hope Azeda and Gloria Karenga, two leaders in the art world in Rwanda. And just a quick note that in recent months, due to challenging times and certainly in an ever-growing need for community, POWarts has been offering very active and robust programming led by an all-volunteer committee, all volunteer. And we've offered these programs to everyone for free. So in order to allow us to keep doing that, if you could join as a member, we would love to have you. If you can make a contribution, we'd be thrilled. And just a few points about etiquette. If you keep yourself muted, I think it's a webinar, so everyone is muted. And if you could introduce yourself in the chat box, it's really nice to know that you're here and who's here with us. And if you can put your questions in the Q&A, we will get to as many as we can at the end of the conversation. So it's really a great pleasure to have the three of you here. We have Suhaly Bautista Carolina, Sheetal Prajapati, and Jasmine Wahi. Suhaly is a community organizer, spiritual herbalist, and arts administrator. Born in New York City to African Dominican parents, her work is rooted in harnessing the collective power and impact of community. Before joining the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute as Director of Public Programs, she served as the Engagement Education Manager at the public art nonprofit Creative Time. In 2017, while in the role of Community Relations Manager at Brooklyn Museum, she also worked as Community Partnership Consultant for Art Built Mobile Studios. Suhaly is the founder of Afrofuturism Book Club, Black Magic, and former curator of Myrtle Avenue's Black Art Story Month, and has worked in various capacities with organizations such as the Laundromat Project, Art Space, Focus, and the Brooklyn Children's Museum. Suhaly joined the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2019 as the Senior Managing Educator of Audience Development and Engagement. Sheetal Prajapati is a Brooklyn-based educator and an artist. She is the principal and founder of Lohar Projects, a boutique advising agency working with individual artists and cultural organizations with a focus on professional development, public engagement, organizational planning, and new initiatives. Sheetal serves on the faculty of the School of Visual Arts and the Masters of Fine Art program, and is a founding board member of Art and Feminism, I love that group, a nonprofit organization dedicated to building and expanding diversity among contributors and content on Wikipedia. So great. Previously, Sheetal spent 15 years leading and building teams to develop engagement, outreach, and special initiatives for diverse audiences of all ages at organizations including Pioneer Works, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. From 2014 to 16, Sheetal co-curated Open Engagement, an international conference on art and social practice. And in 2016 to 17, she co-organized Game Night, a series of free public events presenting artist-made games for play in New York. Jasmine Wahi is a curator, activist, TEDx speaker, and a founder and co-director of Project for Empty Space. Since February, Jasmine has served as the Holly Block Social Justice Curator at the Bronx Museum. That's so great. Her practice predominantly focuses on issues of femme empowerment, complicating binary structures within social discourses and exploring multi-positional cultural identities through the lens of intersectional feminism. In 2010, Jasmine co-founded Project for Empty Space, a not-for-profit organization that creates multidisciplinary art exhibitions and programming that encourage social dialogue, education, and systematic change through the support of both artists and communities. In 2015, Jasmine joined Rebecca Jampol to open a brick and mortar gallery in Newark. Though she does not consider herself to be a social activist, you do. Though she does not consider herself to be an artist, of course you're a social activist. Jasmine has organized numerous interventions and happenings as part of her social activist work. In 2018, she served as the co-chair of Rape, Radicality, and Representation for the College Art Association's Day of Panels with the Feminist Art Project, organizing a day intersectional feminist-based performances, films, and conversations. In 2019, she spoke at TEDxNJ on the idea of resilience. In 2020, she curated the two-part exhibition, Abortion is Normal. Thank you so much for doing that. I saw it multiple times. I have the t-shirt and the stitch, which received wide acclaim and will be touring across the country as part of a campaign to get out the vote. In addition to her other work, Jasmine's a faculty member also at SVA. She's a volunteer instructor for Girls Educational Mentoring Services, and Jasmine's curatorial work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Art News, Art Forum, Hyperallergic, Bloomberg, many more. These are very impressive ladies. Thank you so much for being here. We're thrilled to have you. Sheetal, I hand it to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks to POWarts. As Sarah mentioned, it's been a few months before we could get to this, so we're excited to be here. And thank you to everybody who's listening today. It's great to have an audience, such a robust audience. And just a special thanks to Suhaly and Jasmine, who are two people that I have had the pleasure of knowing for quite some time in New York. And it's been great for our work to intersect in various ways, and I think it makes it kind of a perfect threesome for us to have this conversation together, given the work we've done in parallel to each other and in intersecting in some ways. So very happy to have the two of you here. Thank you. We're gonna have a pretty open discussion. I'm gonna start the conversation. And I just want to acknowledge that we are having this conversation in what is actually the midst of a really big moment for women of color in the United States, with Vice President-elect Harris getting ready to take an oath in January. And no matter what our politics are, I just wanted to acknowledge that for so many of us, it means something personal and that goes way beyond politics. And it also means a lot to the younger women in our lives, wherever and whoever they might be, being able to see a future that includes someone like Vice President-elect Harris in our history books, which is new for us and will be great for younger people to know about as something we did together, this generation. So happy to be in the context of that. So I'm gonna start by opening the conversation about the notion of survival. And, Jasmine, Suhaly, and I had a conversation before this panel to kind of think about what we wanted to talk about. And the word survival can mean a lot of things, but I think for all of us, one of the ways that we were addressing it and thinking about it was how survival is part of our identity inside or outside of the art world. And so I thought I would open the discussion with posing the question to both of you of what role and how do you feel about the term or the process of survival in your own professional practice and in your work as a woman of color in this field?
Jasmine, did you want to start? You want me to start? Thank you so much, Sheetal, first of all, for looping us together, and to Jasmine and to POWarts for having us today. Survival. I love words, so I automatically just start defining them in my mind as what they mean to me. So they're going through the funnel of my translation brain right now. And I connect survival to the beginning of my career when I accepted just enough. Like when I was like, well, whatever I have to do to just get in, that's cool with me. Like I never negotiated. I never advocated for myself. I was just like, let me get through the door, because getting through the door felt like enough, right? Getting through the door was an achievement in and of itself. And I can't divorce that from my own upbringing and my own immigrant parents who were like, let me just get to this new place and then we'll make it work. We'll survive. We'll like just scrape the surface and make it work just to get in, because that, even that feels like hopeful. That feels like more than what I currently have. And so I think about that and how much of that has evolved, because to be in a place of survival means that there's no space left to have a dream. I'm just focusing on being there and glorifying the opportunity to be in a space that truly more people like me should be invited into, right? So I spent a lot of my career, I think, settling, and that those are my automatic responses to like what it meant to enter into the space with this scarcity mentality, maybe, is what I'm thinking about. Just like, this is just enough, so that's exactly what I'll accept. And I think maybe as we get deeper into the conversation, we'll talk about how much of that, how that has evolved over time, and how much of that is about me and how much of that is about the spaces that I'm in or moving through. But I definitely think about survival in relation to like my own upbringing and about how little I accepted because I was told that that was like as much as I was gonna have, you know?
Yeah, I think very similar. My sentiments are almost exactly the same. And you said something that I think struck a chord with me, which is it really about us as surviving surviving as individuals, or is it predicated on the type of hegemonic spaces that we occupy, which historically and even in the contemporary are really not friendly or welcoming, dare I say it, exclusionary of people like us. And so this idea that we're all fighting for crumbs, I think, is something that is very resonant. And I also, in my sort of early phases of my career until not that long ago, would kind of accept crumbs in place of gold. And, you know, if I could give any advice to my younger self, it would be to not do that, and to understand that, you know, you can't pay rent with press, you can't feed yourself with accolades, and you can't, you know, surviving off the bare minimum is not sustainable or enjoyable, but it's definitely not sustainable.
Both of you said some things that kind of triggered a few thoughts for me as well. One of which is, I have to admit for myself, there was a long period of time in my life when I was younger where I didn't understand the way that I was operating the world as a mode of survival, because that was the only thing I knew. And only when I was able to move into bigger spaces, when I left Kentucky, which is where I was raised, and went to college, and then moved into the city of Chicago, and then moved to New York even at the age of 30, that was a new opening for me too. And so for me, survival has partially been a process of discovery and recognition of the self, recognizing for myself what it means to be operating in that mode at all times. And for that to be, for a long time, my base level of operating, not just in my professional life, but in other parts of my life as well. So even just the reframing of that for me personally was a big transition to recognizing then all of these other things that had happened in my career or situations I had been in where, like Suhaly, like nobody ever told me that I could advocate for myself and that I could say no, or that I could say something if I was uncomfortable, because for me, the beginning of my career was in Chicago. For me, at that time, there were just not a lot of other people that looked like me around. And so in any professional space, I was always trying to do a combination of, and I don't know if you two will feel this way, a combination of blending in, but also working really hard to kind of prove my worth. These things were happening simultaneously for me. And when I think about it now, it seems almost funny, but that's how I was operating. I wonder if you guys have can relate to that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually just wrote an essay about surviving in the interstitial space and the sort of like need or the reality of being both, wanting desperately to be both invisible and visible at the same time, or trying to create a specific way that one is to be seen rather than the way that other people may see you. So yeah, for real, that is a thing.
That's a real thing, and it can last for a long time. I'll say that. I don't know, and this is another thing I was thinking about when both of you were speaking, and Suhaly, you referenced it just a little bit, but all three of us are products of immigrants. So we all grew up in a certain kind of diaspora, inside our home, outside our home, in between cultures. And, Suhaly, you mentioned that, for my parents, I can definitely say they came here in a very conscious mode of survival. They knew that they were taking a risk and they were going to a foreign place. I was born here, and so there is like a little bit of a schism there, but primarily what I wanted to say is that my parents, that they instilled some of this into me, not because they didn't want me to own my own identity, but because in their mind, trying to fit in, trying to kind of follow the rules and succeed within the system that was being presented to me was the path towards success. And I'll say in our experiences, the obvious truth is that following that path to success and trying to work within these structures, A, is harder for us than it is for other people, and B, does not always produce the kind of success that maybe we want. And we'll get to this later, does this really nefarious thing of sometimes putting us in the situation of upholding a system that we know is oppressing other people as a means for us to survive, not even to succeed, to survive. And I want to make that distinction because it is important.
Yeah, and I think that I feel like every avenue is its own lane that we could venture into for hours and hours. But I automatically think about my daughter because now I'm raising this next generation, and I feel like seeing her or having her makes me feel like I'm in the middle of something. Like I'm the middle child, right? Like my mom was first to me, and then my daughter is this like infinite future of possibilities, but I'm playing this tug of war between like, well, let's hold on to this because we don't know if it's going to be taken away. So let me keep this job, even though I'm treated like this, or, it's just not values aligned, or it's not in alignment with my purpose. Let me just hold on to that. Because it's more than what my mother had, right? It's all the things that she helped me to get to this place, so that maybe my daughter can like take off from a different starting point, right? So, but then I feel like if she doesn't witness me taking risks and being courageous and like doing more than surviving, will she like come back into this? Will it reverse back into this spiral where really she's not dreaming, she's just also hanging on tight? And then how many more generations will it take for us to really be free, for us to free ourselves and like be limitless and be boundless and do exactly what we need and are here to do? I think about that so much, and I don't have an answer. I just, every day I'm like, what can I do to show her that like anything is possible, and not just say the words, right? Because those words were said those words were said to me. And to some extent, I could now retroactively go back into the videotapes and watch my mom both chase something, but also like hold something. And if I go back into my own tapes, I'm like, ooh, I definitely am doing that also. So yeah, I don't have an answer. These are just like reflections on how this continues on into the future, because I do want it to end. I want this cycle to like be over. How much of that is dependent on my own practice and the ways in which I enter into community and model this behavior, and how much of that is dependent on like all of these structures, right, that Jasmine references, being just like torn to the ground and rebuilt from a place of integrity.
Well, Sheetal, I was going to say this might be a good segue for my question.
I was just going to say, yeah, whatever feels good. I think either topic actually is a good segue. So,
okay, I'll go for it then. So, I guess in thinking about what these structures are and what we're doing in kind of survival mode, and Sheetal, you already kind of referenced this, but the pressures as children of immigrants to maybe do something that is a success leads me to ask now, and as we have come this far in our careers, what are our metrics for success? Because, you know, it can't just be financial success. There has to be something more. Otherwise, I don't think any of us would have stuck with this as long as we have. So, you know, what does success mean or look like? And I asked the question, so I don't have to answer first.
Suhaly, do you want to?
Go ahead. So you start.
All right. You know, this is a really, as Jasmine teed it up, I mean, it's clear that this is a really complicated question. First, you know, beginning with realizing that there is a definition for success within my family from an early age. What that meant for me as a woman, as someone who was born and raised here, there were clear expectations around that. So understanding those, deciding if those were indeed the standards that I wanted to measure my success by, and then getting to the point of recognizing, quite frankly, that I could do that. And I think that there's a lot of, it's very confusing, right? There's success within your diaspora, there's success within the field that you're in, there's success within the scope of you being a woman, and then there's success within the scope of you being a person of color. And I have realized over time that my definition of success has moved further and further away from what you might consider standard rubrics for success in our field, because the more in my career, the more I tried to kind of follow the paths towards the benchmarks that were laid out for me, the less myself I felt, to be just really frank. And so now for me, success in this moment, as someone who started her own business last year in direct response to the experience that I've had for 15 years in institutions of all sizes here and in Chicago, my rubric for success is around a set of values, around a set of my values, why I believe I do the work I do, and around the work that I do is trying to help organizations and individuals understand what their values are and put them into practice. And that dual activity of like defining values and putting them into practice is really important to me. And I found in my career and working in big and small institutions that organizations are really good at saying things that sound really good. They can hire consultants to do that. I'm a consultant, so I've been asked to do that for organizations. But I think, you know, the failure that I see is we talk about it, but there is no systematic or structural change within the institution to support those values in practice. And so for me, that's kind of where I have arrived to over a long period of time. And I recognize that I'm very aware that the way that I position myself and the way that I define success for myself might be detrimental to me sometimes. And if we have time, we can all share stories about that. But I'm okay with that now. But I'm okay with that now because I've been doing what I've been doing for 20 years. And I have built up enough agency and a big enough community and a big enough support system to be able to say no and to be able to reject standards that I don't feel reflect my ambition. So that is a big caveat because it took all this time for me to get here.
I love this. I love the way you speak about it though, because it is this emergent thing, right? It's like you grow up on having this understanding and you're really undoing that while also like redoing your own value-based life and metrics for success. And sometimes that does take time. And sometimes it takes this knowing, or like our generation going through the fire and having it take this long, so then we can reach back and be like, all right, make sure that when you start, this is how you start, all right? Because I did this for 20 years, right? I want to be able to pay that forward so that we don't waste time, so that we have a different starting point with young people. Obviously, young people are very important to me and talk about them all the time, but it really is this like, what's next, right? What's next, and how do we learn? How do we bring these learnings that Sheetal is revealing here through your own personal journey into the next wave, so that they can start somewhere further along, and understand that shaping your future is in your hands, that is a real truth, and that you can claim that truth earlier than, like earlier than the moment which you're like fed up with all the 20 years of oppressive work environments, right?
Where you're backed into a corner.
Yeah, that's right. But I also think that our parents did, like, setting us up for success was my mom's value. That was her main goal, and she did that. Like, I'm proud of her. Like, I have to applaud that. That was her value, was to like get out of this X situation, come here and build and set the stones and make sure we had the opportunities that she never had, and she achieved that, right? So I want to celebrate that any occasion that I have to put voice behind that success is I'm going to take it. And also money, like fiscal health, that is another value. Like, you might have it, it might be high on your hierarchy of values, it might be less high. And so understanding that financial health, either financial like baseline health or financial security or like big dollars is your value, also helps you, I think, define how you move to get to where you want to go, right?
Absolutely. And I agree. I think I never really thought about it that way, but yeah, successes have different shapes and forms and also different rubrics. So the journey that my parents went on for my sister and I is absolutely one type of success. And I don't think that any of us need to necessarily have a monolith of what success looks like. We can have parallel and multiple successes that intersect with one another. And I feel like I say this like ad nauseum, everyone's probably sick of hearing it, but there's no reason that we have to gauge anything as a singularity by a singular circumstance. And I was just like madly scrolling through my Instagram to find this quote, sort of meme quote, I guess, that made me realize something about myself. And I haven't actually done anything to change this, but at least I acknowledge that it's a reality. And it's a quote from Diversity in Academia. It said, "My therapist just told me that I'm such a product of capitalism that I've replaced any real joy with accomplishments. And I've never been so accurately dragged in my life." And I think that was sort of like an amplification of who I am. And now I'm looking really hard at what that actually means. Like, are my metrics for success based on how other people define success or other people define me? Or, and that's where accolades come in. It's a recognition from your peers or whoever. Or does any of that truly matter? Can we still achieve the same level of, of work and accomplishment and, dare I say, success without necessarily having to acquiesce to other people's criteria for what makes us good or smart or not smart, or strong or successful. And I think we're really in this like kind of moment of reckoning that there's been a crescendo to this pinnacle moment that we're in right now about really looking hard at what our institutional structures are and what merits climbing the ladder, as long as we still have ladders that are that need to be climbed. What are our criteria for making sure people can get up there? Who is going up there? How do we uplift them and make sure that other people are getting to the top? Because success shouldn't just look like one thing. It shouldn't be based on optics, nor should it be based on some sort of like passed down, there shouldn't be heirloom legacies anymore that we use to benchmark our successes. Now I'm going off on a tangent. Also, I have a small dog here who keeps crying for me to play with her, which is why I keep doing this. But yeah, that isn't even really a question. I think it's just time maybe for like a mass reconsideration of what success means kind of like holistically between all of us. And maybe it's more than what we've all kind of been conditioned to think it is.
Yeah, I think, Jasmine, you bring up a really good point about the moment that we're in now, where there is quite frankly, a more national conversation than there ever has been in my entire life about some of these things that I would venture to assume you all have kept personal for many years of your life too, and in different situations where like, I can't talk about this, like I need to move through this. There's not space for me to unpack these things or kind of grapple with the complex spaces that I'm in, sometimes contradictory spaces that I'm in. And I think it goes back to our conversation about success. And I will use my time at MoMA as an example of this. The entire time I was there, I learned an incredible amount. I had amazing bosses who were also my mentors, and I was able to hire people that I felt really inspired by. So much of my thinking came out of my experience and my response to that experience there. But simultaneously, while all of those amazing things were happening, while I was using MoMA's money to program, to make free programming for artists and bring in emerging artists into our program, while I was doing all that great stuff, there were all these other things going on at the same time. And, even though I was having what many would call by success by multiple standards, including my own, that success came at a price. And it came at a price that I was willing to pay for about 6 years. And at the end of that 6 years, I realized that it was no single person at MoMA. That I can't point to one situation or somebody that treated 1% treated me really badly. But in that time, I realized the structure and the system that I was working in. And it was shown to me in so many brutal ways that I realized that I needed to find another space to have, even if I wanted to have the same kind of success, I had to have it somewhere else. Because to that point, the success I was having, which was real success, the price was too high for me. And I think that is a real thing because, I mean, MoMA is MoMA. Everybody, I mean, when I left there, people were shocked that I left there. And it is reasonable that many young people want to work at places like that. And there's a lot of good to having experiences at big institutions, absolutely. But nobody tells you what else that means for you. And I just want to bring that up because these things can happen simultaneously. So in thinking about defining success or how success happens or what rubric we're using for it, all of that can happen while these other not so great things are happening. And I'm just really grateful that now we can talk about the not so great things and kind of break this like weird schism between like these really wonderful, beautiful things and these really like dark, terrible things, and say these happen at the same time and together and maybe because of each other. So we need to untie this. This is way more complicated than one issue or inclusivity training.
Right. I mean, I think transparency is also key in that, right? For so long, and not just in our industry, but there have been so many ways to quiet or hush up the negative things that happen that kind of like perpetuate this false promise or illusion of like the perfect environment or the, you know, like the best of the best, the pinnacle of, again, success within certain spaces. And I think, like you said, the key is not being, and this is obviously much easier said than done, but not being afraid of repercussion to be honest and candid with your peers or with other people in your circle about what's happening. Because there are certain, you know, myself included, there are certain things that I wish I had known about places places and spaces that I entered into. But, you know, because of our fear of repercussion, we often don't talk about these things. And I think we should. And one of the ways to hold places and people accountable is simply by calling them to task. And that is one of the things that I think is important about this moment. Although I do have some qualms with certain ways of call out culture, but overall, the kind of middle ground of being able to speak freely, I think, is so important. Because there are places that are touted as, you know, again, the best of the best, that are really significantly places of violence and aggression. You know, my graduate school experience was one of those. And anyone who asks me, I'm very candid with them about it. And I think that's, you know, it's hard. And it's hard to be sort of like the rebel or the first person to break the dam. But once it's broken, hopefully it ultimately leads to something much better. And I mean, I applaud people like Shadria Bouvier at the Guggenheim for being very vocal and speaking out about the violences that she dealt with. Even though now that has sort of like exploded into what it has, but, you know, if we're going to be candid about things, that's a great example right there of being one of the first to be that vocal and then suffering the consequence for it, but as a way to kind of like pave a better way for the rest of us, regardless of like what you think about the situation. I think it's hard to not to applaud the type of courage that it takes to do that.
Yeah. And I think it's also important with that example, and I think all of us have probably been in a situation like this in our careers where we recognize that we're in problematic spaces. And although there's a lot to contend with, we also recognize those are places of power that we have to like give back to our communities. So the artists that I got to work with, the people that you all get to bring into the places you're in, you know, that is part of the success too, even though it's like within this bigger system. And so just like, I don't know, I think for me, one of the things I think about a lot is how contradictory so many of the spaces that I'm in are. And a lot of that contradiction, when it comes down to it, has a direct connection to my identity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and just I don't have anything else to say about it except to just kind of that recognition of like, you know, you're always negotiating.
Mm-hmm.
And you
Things I won't though. There's some things I'm like, oh, I'm not negotiating on that.
Yeah.
Either I'm in or I'm out. But I can't, but as an act of self-care, I can't enter into every battle, even though I know the battle is happening. Like,
right.
Seen them all. Now the cloak has been lifted, right? And I see, and maybe I've seen for a long time, but now everyone else sees, right? But I'm like, I can't fight that, and that, because then I would be giving 10% of my energy to 10 different things. And is that the way that I want to use my agency and power? It took me this long, though, of being in the arts to understand that it was a choice. That I was telling myself, like, oh, unpaid internships, yeah, that's my focus. I'm going to spend the next 3 years entering into all the conversations necessary to make sure I tackle that. Because if I don't have focus, then I'm just a master of none, right? Yeah, jack of all trades, master of none. And also, I'm just poking holes in all the things, but I can't pivot all of my energy to problem solve that thing, if that's what I want to do, if that's what I choose to do. Right. But that's totally right, is that we see, I think everyone has seen that the truth is revealed, and now we make choices about the ways in which we use the agency that we have in these spaces.
Although the amount of gaslighting that continues to go on in the wake of the veil being lifted it's not surprising, but nonetheless, it's like astounding, just the level to which people will desperately cling on to the modes of power that they're used to. And not just like, you know, it's not even about divestment, it's about recalibration. You know, there's a way for multiple things, as is clear from this talk, there's a way for multiple things to exist at the same time. You just have to get with the party. You just have to join the party and be down for that, rather than, you know, like iron fisting whatever it is that you believe is right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Suhaly.
No, I was just going to say about erasure, like women of color, all the women of color that we know, and thanks Jasmine for like talking about the gaslighting. Like I'm also an herbalist, so I have to like snap out of it sometimes in my art world life, where I'm like, center yourself, return to the greater purpose, like understand what you're doing in this space is not your entire life. Like, is this in alignment with who you are when you close the laptop? I mean, now we're closing the laptop. When you leave the gallery or you leave the museum, is that in alignment with who you are? Because who you are is not your job too. I tell, like, whenever I speak to teens, I tell them that too. I'm like, there's your purpose and then there's your title. And if they're both aligned, that's fantastic. But sometimes they're not. Right. And that's okay. But be clear about what you're doing in this role, so that when you leave, you can sleep. You can say, like, the thing that I'm doing in my job, it serves a higher purpose. It's aligned with my values. It's something that I care about. But women of color, my whole community of women of color in the arts, and my whole community in the arts is mostly women of color, if not exclusively. So I want to, you know, enter that into the space too. But we experience so much erasure. Just like, I mean, like, even recently I'm experiencing an episode of like, but this was my idea. And so what happened to that, you know, or like I guarded against that and it still happened. And so now we're here. And now I'm also being asked to solve the thing that I tried to guard us against. So how do we hold all of that labor at the same time, which I think a lot of times women of color are like holding?
Honestly, this is like purely pragmatic strategy, but we live in the age of surveillance. So I have started doing things like really writing down my ideas and like putting in the footer a copyright and a date, because that level of erasure and what's it called? Just like idea snatching is happens all the time. I think all three of us can probably empathize, and many people in the audience, with that experience. But now, you know, since we live in this age of technology and recording, you might as well use it to your advantage. And I write down all of my ideas, and I make sure that it is known that I'm the originator of them, or if I'm not and it's someone else's idea, I make it known that this was their idea, because it's important, again, to hold not only ourselves but other people accountable, so that, you know, in the struggle for survival or thriving, we need to be able to, you know, keep our ideas as capital. That's really, I mean, at the end of the day, that's all we have as creatives, is our intellectual capital.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Suhaly, your point about focus is really well taken, because and I'll just speak for myself in this particular case. There have been times in my career where I don't have focus, don't have like a goal in mind, I can get lost because there was no one around me to like guide me back. So if I didn't have a guiding idea or a guiding thought in what I was doing, no one was going to help me find it. I mean, just that wasn't going to happen. And I think about this a lot because, you know, my parents, they are amazing and wonderful. But when I started working in the arts, my father specifically really questioned that and questioned the economic success of it, the sustainability of it, and so forth and so on. And I always joked with people, I said, if I have enough conviction to convince my father that I'm good at something he doesn't understand, then I can do anything that I want. But that's actually real. Like that, growing up as a young person in 19, 20, 21, and my dad really grilling me on like, you want to work in nonprofits, you want to work in the arts, like why? You could be an engineer or this or that. I mean, I really had to understand why I was doing what I was doing. And I just have to say, in line with Suhaly talking about the sacrifices our parents made and Jasmine talking about what success meant to them and for them, I was always really grateful for that. And even though it sounds like kind of harsh, it was so important for me to have that belief in myself, because there were times in my career where no one else would.
Yeah, and I think that dovetails very gracefully into my question about community and how we find our people in the arts and what that was like for each of us. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how you found your people, and did you put up the back call? Did you struggle? Did you do it one by one? How did we get here where we feel like, you know, this is a community right here? But how did we get here?
Yeah, I think it's a constant evolution, I think. But for me, initially, right out of undergrad, I joined SAUCY, the South Asian Women's Creative Collective. And that really became my family and my community that I hadn't had during undergrad and during my, you know, previous 4 years living in New York. And I think that was the beginning. And through that, you know, we are in small communities, you tend to spread quickly, and our networks are strong, and it just kind of like grew out from there.
I didn't really have a community of people of color in the first part of my career. I think when I entered into the arts after undergrad, I kind of assumed it would be like Kentucky. where I was the only person, and I was very used to that positioning, quite frankly. So in grad school, there, I started to meet a few, not even other Indian people, just people of color, period. But when I started working in museums, I'll be really honest, until I moved to New York, I didn't think I could have a community of color in the arts that could support me the way that I imagined, or the way I needed that support. Because my first part of my career was in the Midwest, and there just wasn't a concentration of us. And I also think that was 20 years ago. So there was also a really different understanding of what someone like me was doing in the arts. And I think we were still at a place where the assumption was that I wanted to be like everyone else, which is, good or bad. I do think that's how it was. And only here, at the age of 30, when I moved to New York, it was the first time I looked around me and I'm like, well, I don't just need to find Indian people. There are all kinds of people here. There are so many diasporas here. There are so many people here that can understand my experience, not because their experience is the same, but because it's parallel.
Mm-hmm.
And building community around that intersectionality has been really great for me in this second part of my career, I guess, like past being, a young person, I guess. And I'm very grateful for it. And I tell young people all the time, I'm like, find your peers. Yes, find mentors. Yes, whatever, find the people that are gonna help you get where you want to be, but find your peers. Because they're the people that are gonna walk with you.
Yeah. And I think it's also, like the visibility of us as like the few and far between little peppercorns in the rice. It's like when I saw you do that, like the head nod thing, and you're like, okay, we see each other because there's so few of us. And I used to always like make fun of my parents when we went on vacation because they would see like another Desi or South Asian person, and immediately there would be like a eyeball rapport. But I get it because, that is actually genuinely how I have met people outside of like the initial saucy space. Was we see each other and we understand that our experiences, like you said, are parallel. And that is another way, honestly.
Yeah. Suhaly, do you want to share a little bit about your experience with community?
Sure. Yeah, well, I'm a native New Yorker. And I come from like an organizing background. So I feel like I had community before I entered into the arts, and that because I entered through this like public art avenue, that there were some connections or weaving together. So I wouldn't say I started at zero, but when I got inside the organizations, that's when it got a little scary. Like, I think then I felt really isolated. I felt like a really problematic thing would be said and I would be physically horrified. But then I would be looking around to see if anyone else was horrified. And it often, either you were there too long and you had heard it 1,000 times, so you were neutralized, or you were too scared to even physically respond to the mess, so you just like froze. And then when I did start to be like, this is problematic, I alienate myself and I become a target, right? And I'm already a target because I already stick out. Mm-hmm. So that's just like a story. Yeah. But I think the way that I found community was like paying attention to what people were saying. Mm-hmm. Or like hearing the language that people were using. And sometimes even in my current role at the Met, paying attention to what my white colleagues are saying and who was willing to like stick their neck out to advocate on behalf of people of color, or who even noticed, I think sometimes when there was erasure or I wrote it down, Jasmine, idea snatching, or when something happened that was just not right? Like who in here is gonna do it before me? Because you all know I'm gonna do it. Yeah. So if I let the room be silent for just 5 extra seconds before reacting from this like personal place, because it's a lot of times it's personal. I wait and see, and sometimes I build community that way. Yeah. It's like understanding that X and X and X in those departments, like, okay, well, this is part of that committee that is fighting for something greater at this institution. We obviously need to have our own WhatsApp channel where we can like organize from the inside, because it's true, we need to be everywhere, right? We need to be outside, inside, underground, above, in our own institutions, in the institutions, because I think it's like an all sides approach.
Yeah. It's too easy for things to keep going the way that they are. And your example is perfectly stated. People in meetings that have heard this 1,000 times who haven't moved mentally to a place where they can realize that what is complacency for them is trauma for us. And like I said, there's no way, I don't want other people to experience that. Absolutely not. But I feel like there is a huge gap there. And I experienced this at MoMA a lot where, it was like, don't ruffle feathers. Like, oh, this person says things like this all the time. I'm like, do you understand how I feel every time it's said?
Yeah.
And do you understand how I feel when I look around a room, 1 person, 2 person, 10 people, 12 people, and everyone's looking down? Because that's the other thing, the recognition that these things happen, but then the inability to actually act on them. And Suhaly, your point is a really good point, because there are people that do and will. And it is important for them to be part of your community too.
Right. Yep.
Absolutely.
I want it to be in my goal. And if like, I don't want to define what young and older and elder means, but like my dream is that I have an intergenerational community of people of color in the arts, women of color in the arts, that because we have so many leaders, like, and I don't even want to go through, I'm like thinking of Linda Good Bryant and like Marta Moreno Vega and all of these incredible women of color. And I'm like, I want to be in the room with you because I want to know what happened, how you like fought this, who stopped you, who tried to stop you, how did you move through that? And then for us to have a certain level of wisdom operating in a different environment, climate, generational stuff, social media, which we could make a whole nother panel about success and visibility and who gets social media clout and how we see success and who gets chosen, who are the chosen 10 that everybody talks about, when the truth is that there's hundreds of us, thousands of us in New York alone that are doing this work. But I would love to, what I'm saying is I'm critiquing my own community. I'm saying that because I curated it, it looks a certain way, but I would love to like challenge my own self to stretch that out, because I think there's more collective learning with like the timelines stretching out a little bit.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it would be wonderful if more people had the same impetus, Suhaly. And I will again go back to this, which is, to a certain extent, we had to find people to move through. Not that other people can just be alone, but I mean, we had to put an extra effort in to seek some of this out for ourselves. And Suhaly, you said this at the beginning of the conversation, like one of the things that I feel compelled by is being in a position now where I can try to ensure that young people won't have the same experiences. Right? We don't have all the answers. We've all said that at least once during this conversation, but I think we do have experience. And I think at the end of the day, what I would have given for that when I was 21, when I was 22, I'm like, if there's any young people out there that want that, I want to be able to do that. And honestly, that is part of the impetus for even organizing this dialogue.
We should make a handbook.
Straight up. Yeah, we should make a handbook, right? So it's 1:00 now. We can end by like each offering a little advice if we want to, or we can go straight to questions, because I feel like we've also offered advice during this conversation too.
I feel like the gems will flow from the question and answer.
Yeah, let's do questions.
Okay, let's do Q&A.
Oh, how should we do this?
Yeah, so is Sarah, should we just look?
I can, no, I mean, you're welcome to go through them, or we can just go through them together in the order that came in. Fari, hi Fari. I love that your rubric for success is values-based. Can you share some of those values and maybe give an example of when you feel like you were really successful in a project?
Oh, that's a good question. So I will say that this is an idea that's still in process for me, and I'm still like working out like what that actually means for me. But I think about my set of values is very reflective of my experience. So I actually think about my values as statements about how I want things to happen. So I want to provide the most equitable and opportunistic space for young people of color. That's something that I think about a lot. And I do that through volunteering to be a mentor for New Ink at the New Museum. I do that through doing studio visits with anybody of color that ever contacts me. I really do. And like, these are the ways that I perform some of those things. Another value that I've thought about a lot and I've talked about a little bit here is the benefit of saying no and like the value in stepping away from something. And I know that seems really simple, but as we've discussed, that's not always easy to do. And I think about that both in the kinds of clients I choose to work with and don't choose to work with, as well as the way that I do my actual consulting work, all the way to interviewing for jobs. I mean, you know, agency is a value to me. And that is something that I am still continuing to figuring out how to practice for myself, but also how to embed that into the work that I do. I don't want to talk about a bunch of examples, but I hope that that answers your question a little bit, gives you a sense of kind of like where I'm going with that idea. Sarah, do you know the order of the questions? Because I'm just seeing what.
No, I'm just looking. There's some that are coming in the chat, and there's some that are coming in the Q&A. So I'll just go through the Q&A, and then we can get to chat after. So the next one that came in from Rashida, in regards to success, how do we overcome the art world's reliance on institutional validation, degrees, shows, residencies, etc., that have the power and privilege disparities baked into them in our effort to get our ideas and work seen, heard, engaged with?
That is a wonderful question, Rashida. Wherever you are, I am making an offering because I just read this article by Bell Hooks called Teaching to Transgress. I don't know if anyone else has read it, but it's about knowledge that's rooted in experience.
It is the best book ever.
Yeah, it's a really great book. So I would start there because I feel like it gave me a lot of confidence to advocate for my own wisdom and the type of intelligence that I place value in, and to just like continuously bring it up, continuously bring up experience, wisdom, knowledge, inherited wisdom, right? Learned wisdom, and all the different types of ways of knowing. I know that's not an answer. I think the way that I do this is I always like go into meetings and I'm like, well, I've never taken an art class, so that's not my expertise. But I've been a community organizer since I was 14. So if we're going to talk about community today, or people, or relationship building, or these key things, well, I have those experiences, so I can make offerings in that arena,
Mm-hmm.
But just like declaring, right, where your wisdom lies is a strategy that I use for that type of knowledge. I don't know if anyone else wants to.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think there are a couple of things. One is it is possible. Well, I'll preface it by saying that it is not fair that this is the way it has to be, but it is possible for us to make our own spaces and institutions and rubrics. I started Project for Empty Space with Meenakshi Therakode because there was there was nothing that matched really what I wanted to do, and the opportunity arose. So, again, unfortunately, we have to do it this way, but if there isn't a space or place for you, you just have to make it. And there are enough peers in the world and in New York City or wherever you are, like we're everywhere. You just have to find us, or we just have to find each other, that we can create our own system. Because the reality is, the way to kind of dismantle the architecture of the structures is by being transparent, is by demanding more. The issue with demanding more is that we all en masse have to want it. And so it's a process, and it's a long, unlearning and dismantling is not something that happens overnight. And so I think it's in the short term, or maybe the longish term, it's about creating our own opportunities for each other, while also demanding, progressive, not progressive as in left wing, but progressive as in creating progress, change within our systems, and hope that they happen, or strive for them to happen in our lifetimes, and if not, for the people who come after us.
The next question is from Kantara. In an era of surveillance, institutional gaslighting, and white supremacy in the world and in the arts, how have you dealt with making mistakes on the job? How do you resist taking it personally as diaspora and as women of color in predominantly white spaces where people are hyper-focused on you and your work? It's a good question.
I have come to a place where, and I have conversations, some of you may know this person, Jarrett Videra. We have conversations all the time about, is it racist or is it just me? And I have come to a point where, when something really crazy and gaslighty happens, gaslighty is a new term, apparently, happens, I try my best to recognize that the reaction to it is far less about me than it is about the people who are reacting, even when it's my mistake, because there are ways in which that are appropriate to respond to mistakes or things that have gone wrong. And often I have found in my experience that I receive sort of like the brunt or the shit end of the stick with the way people react to things. And I just lean into the idea that, I am who I am and the world is what it is. And at a certain point, I just can't take it personally. And sometimes you just really have to stand up for yourself, like call me a fluffer. I will shake it up if something feels wrong or unfair. Again, even if it's my mistake, and someone comes at me sideways, I'll check them on it, because we have to advocate for ourselves.
Yeah. I think, Jasmine, that's a great response. And it's a tricky question. And I will say two things about it. One, part of dealing with this is how you deal with other people making mistakes in your workspace. And the other part of it that I think is important to remember is that, you are responsible for what you do and what you say. And people are not always going to respond to it positively, even if you feel like it is that way. And so I think there's a balance between, there is always an impetus to blame yourself. Like, I'm being oversensitive, or like I made a really big mistake, and so it warrants this kind of reaction. But let me tell you something. Nothing in the workplace warrants gaslighting. Nothing, no mistake. And so I think that's also like a place, like a mental place to try to kind of aspire to, which is like, there's actually no circumstance in which I should be questioning whether this person is making a pejorative comment about my identity. That we shouldn't have to worry about that. And I think in any situation where you're not sure how much blame you have to take for whatever the thing is that happened, you should step back for a second and be like, okay, is this response proportional to the mistake that I made? Because that is real. And this is we forget this because for us, there's no boundary between professional and personal, but we are in professional spaces. And we can put forward that framework when we need to employ it to protect ourselves. Not for work environments are not personal and professional for everyone the way they are for us. I'm talking about women of color. So just know that, give yourself a break, number one. And number two, recognize that there's no circumstance under which you should tolerate that kind of behavior. Even if you made a big mistake. No one should be shouting at you. You shouldn't be crying because of somebody else's reaction. It happens way too often, not just because we're women of color, but to many women in institutions. So that's my hard line about it.
Yeah. Thank you for that very hard line, which I agree with entirely. Vina has a question directed at Suhaly. You mentioned putting your focus on one cause at a time so you can put 100% into it rather than putting 10% into 10 different things. How do you know when you're ready or the cause is ready to move to the next thing? How do you define success in that instance?
Thank you, Vina. I don't know that I figured it out my own self, right? And also noting that we're sometimes working within institutions where the priorities are set for us, and that they fluctuate based on what is happening in the world, what becomes more important than the last priority we set to the powers that be, and sometimes that can teeter us off of our block. So what I have started to do is just ensure that my team, where I have the most sort of agency, understands what our goal is in relationship to the greater mission and the greater priorities. But what are we focused on for the next 3 years? What are that could be 1, 2, or 3 things, depending on the size of your team, depending on your capacity to execute, but that they're all in alignment with each other and back with the institutional purpose or mission or goal. I think that sometimes that changes, your timeline changes, and we have to be open to to me, this is really hard because setting a goal means that I work fiercely to achieve that, but also being an organizer means that I'm more focused on process than than the product. And so I commit to the process knowing that within that process, things may change, and that's okay as long as we're working collaboratively with integrity and with a goal in sight that we all determine together. So I think that it's such a weird thing to say, but I feel like you'll be ready when you're ready, and you should set your metrics for success at the beginning and know and understand that both the metrics and the ultimate product may change along the way. So I feel like I'm always returning to them, and that the practice of returning to them gives us that North Star that I feel like is really critical and sometimes lacking, which allows us to say yes to various different things that are not back here in this focal point. So I feel like you set the parameters and the benchmarks early on. Maybe they change, but reset them so that they're clear, repeat them so that everyone on your team has an understanding of what they are, and be open to change, right? God is change. The only everlasting truth is change, like Octavia Butler said. So those are some of my thoughts around that question.
We have one last question from Megan. Could you say more about people of color being pitted against each other in predominantly white institutions? How can we build community or coalitions when different generations and people are navigating, learning their definitions of success?
Self-organize with the staff of color in your institution, period. I made the mistake of not making a concerted effort to do that at MoMA, and I wish that I had. It was hard to, but I could have, and I just wasn't thinking in that way. But an institution, a large institution that's predominantly white, the system itself is meant to dilute the power that you collectively have with each other. And the only way you are going to break boundaries of religion, age, class, all the different things that exist within this larger group of people of color that work in your institution, that work can only be done if you're sitting together in a room and starting to have those conversations and recognizing that the larger goal requires you all to be aligned in your goal, in your strategy, as Suhaly is talking about. So it's a brave thing to do, but to me, that's the simplest answer.
And like releasing ego. Like so many times I'm like, this is about me. This is about me. Like, I'm like, no, that's actually, no, it's not. It's not about me. And if I just send a separate email to this person, and like Sheetal was saying, and self-organize, we can come to the understand, we can like tear away all the muck that allows us to think something that's not true. It's not even true. We come to the fundamental truth of what it is by like you said, Sheetal, going through the other avenue. Just a brave thing to do and a hard thing to do.
Right. And just recognizing that even in your coming together, you all can still have your own individual goals of success and still come together and have a collective goal for success that is good for everybody, right? It doesn't mean you all have to be the same or think the exact same way about everything. And this is where what Suhaly said about having a goal and being focused, and especially in group work like this, where you are dealing with the dominant white population of the institution and you are such a small group, being focused is very helpful. And acknowledging that everyone's different, even though we're coming together around something unifying.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing to that is there are absolutely gatekeepers within our own communities. There are handfuls of them. And sometimes it is about, with love and care, addressing that with them, and seeing how there's a way to coalition build. And, maybe people are able to amplify their peers of color while still being able to maintain, their own idea of success, and kind of like, tear down some of these gatekeeping structures. Like, you can be successful, very successful, and not keep other people out. There's enough for us to go around. There's enough room at the table. And so sometimes it is just like having those loving, tough love conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
they're hard, but they're possible.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I want to make sure we bring this up before our time runs out, because Suhaly brought it up in our pre-panel conversation, which is about the role that self-care plays in everything we've talked about. So I would love it, Suhaly, Jasmine, if you wanted to just speak a few words about that, because I feel like that might be a nice way for us to like wrap this up a little too.
I felt like a walking ad for Essentia water as I was like on this panel. I kept like, but that's my number one, right? There you go. That's my number one advice. It's like, drink water, eat good foods, eat your vegetables. Like, remember that you're human. Remember that you're gonna make mistakes. That's cool. Like, trust yourself. And remember that your job is not your life. Like, your job is your job. And if you have a role that feels purposeful, like, give it your all for the time that you decided you were going to do that this week. Understand the value of your time. And yeah, I feel like this pandemic has supported me in doing that. And like Sheetal said, boundary setting and being clear about that. But yeah, I think like I can get very specific. Like, I take a bath, I like crazy bubble bath, like luxurious bubble bath with all the fixings and the rose petals and all of that, like at least once a week. I read my favorite books at night. I like obviously have a whole herbal protocol of like teas and tinctures and things that I do to keep myself healthy. I share those with my family so that we're not, we're all in the practice of like keeping ourselves healthy. I do tarot, like I speak to the universe I consult with my ancestors. Like, I do a lot of things that when I get knocked off my center at work, I have those practices that I can like return to like remember the truth about the wider truth about what happens when we get stuck in the nucleus and we forget about the universe, and how like, yeah, just like remember who we are and what we're here for, and what we're here to do is greater than the shitty situation that happened. So yeah, those are some of the things I think about when I think about self-care. Very important to me.
Yeah, I am with you on the water drinking for sure. And it has taken me a very long time, like basically until last year, to understand boundaries between work and home life, because work is basically my life. And so I make a vested effort, like on weekends, I will not respond to emails or texts about work. Just, it's a hard stop for me. And it really took me a long time to like unlearn that habit. And now thankfully, Rebecca, my partner, understands that like, unless it says emergency, the building is on fire, like I'm just not going to respond. And I do like really mundane, basic girl things. Like I watch a lot of HGTV and like other cooking shows, and I drink a lot of wine, and I spend a lot of time with myself, which used to kind of scare me because I felt like I would have FOMO, or I would be, you know, like, I guess it's just FOMO, left out of something. But I take great solace in now being, just having me time. Because otherwise, you know, we work in such a social industry, you're constantly bombarded with people and like the 8 million ways for people to get in contact with you. And so sometimes it's just like getting rid of all of that and being in community with yourself. And it's, I don't know, maybe it's hard for me because I'm sort of a workaholic, but it was hard to get there. But now, now that I'm in it, I really enjoy the sort of like unplugged, no art time. And like, I very rarely go and see art when it's not work related, because sometimes I need not art in my life.
Yep.
Little secret.
These are really good responses. This is gonna tell you a little about me. That one of the things that I consider a form of self-care is to constantly understand and accept myself. I tend to be a workaholic. I'm very ambitious. Like there are things I know about myself that can be destructive, but they're also the way that I am. And so part of my self-care is actually just recognizing that that's the way that I instinctively operate, and then instead of trying to change that, trying to do other things that offset that. So whether that is, you know, I've been going for a lot of walks. That's been one of my favorite things to do during the pandemic. But even before, I just didn't have time to do it. But like Jasmine, I've also created some really real restrictions in my life, which is I also don't work on the weekends anymore at all, unless it's an emergency. And I've been thinking a lot about how many hours a week I want to work, and trying to make sure that I don't work more than those hours, even if I spend the rest of my time sitting on my couch. Oh, also, and this is, I don't know if this is a problem for other people, but sometimes I feel guilt about wasting time. Like, oh, I'm just watching TV, and like I could be doing these like 20 other things, but letting go of that too, which is, I think, part of like accepting who you are, and like realizing that sometimes you need dumb distractions, and sometimes you need to be alone, even when it's hard to be alone. So, and I think in some ways the pandemic has given some of us more than others, depending on our life circumstance, a chance to have a little bit more space to actually know ourselves better, which I think for me has been the biggest form of self-care that's taken place over the last year, of me like understanding that I'm only limited by not taking care of myself. And that's a real thing, whether that's mental, physical. I have a therapist, I'm sure many people do, but like these things and staying committed to them, right? And making sure that prioritizing taking care of yourself as much as you prioritize your next big project. Because all of us are passionate about what we do. So I think it's, even though for many of us, our job is our job, but our job is also the thing that like gets us going in the morning. So there's this like weird tension of like, I can't always let that feeling go. But yeah, just knowing myself. That's kind of that's the sum of my response. I see one more question here. Sarah, should we take it?
Can I add one more thing,
Yes.
Sheetal, to what you said that I forgot to mention, which was the idea of emergencies in art. Unless someone is doing someone else bodily harm, none of us, I'm making a sweeping assumption here, but I don't think any of us are brain surgeons, and no one's going to die on the table if you don't respond to so-and-so thing immediately. So, you know, emergencies are relative, of course, but most of the time it can wait until Monday.
Yeah. One time when my boss in my first job went on maternity leave and she left like a note, like what to do in her absence kind of. And she was like, it's just art. One of the things is like, it's just art. If you don't have to call 911, like stop.
It's cool.
And I still have it. I still like cut it out and put it on my desk so I can be like, oh, right.
Yeah. That's a really great point, Jasmine, to just for everyone to remember that what we're doing is absolutely important. But for the most part, it's not life or death.
Yeah, for the most part.
I mean, hopefully, like, don't you feel like coronavirus kind of put that into perspective too, where you're like, I don't want to go to an opening because an opening is just not important right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Like, it's not even like, oh, I can't go. It's like, no, like bigger things are going on in the world.
And now I'm like, well, what can we?
Yeah. But
now museums become in this moment. That's a separate panel.
That's for another day.
Yep, it's another panel. Well, I think we only have a few minutes left. So Sarah, should we wrap it up?
We have another, I think people are thanking the three of you for this talk. And I also, I love that you're ending on this note of self-care. And I think I'll add that I think part of self-care is also talking openly about this, which, you know, we tend to do in our smaller circles, but we don't speak about the issue of self-care in these wider conversations. And I think that's such a great way to support each other in that effort as well.
Sarah. That's great. Well, Suhaly, Jasmine, thank you so much. I feel like we could talk for hours. So this was inspiring and makes me smile. So
yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone out there we can't see.
Yes, thank you all. And thanks again, Sarah and POWarts.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Have a great day.
Conversation. Thank you.
Bye.